have my little helper here, so I am ready to sew. What do you have to say for yourself?
So before we get started, you just need a couple of things. Obviously, you need a sewing machine that can do both a straight and a zigzag stitch. And I have a walking foot on my sewing machine just because I think that helps a lot getting those different layers of those very thin fabrics to move together simultaneously. If your machine has like a dual feed or something like that, then you don't really need a walking foot. My needles that I'm using is a Microtex needle. I just purchased mine from Schmidt's and I get them in bulk off of Amazon, but you know, any craft supply store tends to have Schmidt's needles and Microtex. And then the thread that I'm using is going to be a polyester thread. I like using Coats & Clark, but you can use any brand that you prefer to use. But I would definitely say you need a polyester thread just because it has a little bit more strength and durability. If you were to use something like a cotton thread or silk, it would be more likely to snap on those areas of the bras where you have a lot of tension and are putting stretch on too. So definitely use polyester thread.
So I always like to start with my cups first before making the cradle. So you're going to need both your bottom and your top cup in the lace and the lining fabric. So I will put my bottom cups together with the lining fabric, and then I take my top cup and I'm going to pin it on there along this top curve. Then we'll flip it over and pin the lining to the other side. So once you have your lace pinned on right sides together, I flip it around and pin on my other lining piece. You could do all 4 of these at once, but I just find that it's a little tricky for me to get them lined up, so it's easier to do it like this for me. So I'm just going to repeat this pinning process for the other cup, and then what we're going to do is sew a 1/4 inch of a seam allowance along that pinned curve, which is right here. And we just want to use a straight stitch at 1/4 inch. So here you can see we've just done that 1/4 inch straight stitch along that curved line. Make sure you just sort of go slow while you're doing this and move the fabric around so you're not getting any tucks or anything like that. So once you've made that seam line, you can just take those 2 upper cut pieces and pull them towards the top. And you should have a nice, beautifully encased seam in there. So now we're just going to do a line of top stitching, and I'm going to do it along the top cup, and we're going to do probably like 1/8 inch or scant 1/8 inch straight stitch on that side, and that's just going to make sure all those layers sort of lay flat and keep everything in place where we want to continue using them. Okay, so you can see here we have that line of stitching on the inside that just keeps that seam really flat, and on the outside it's not super visible, but you will have that little bit of top stitching. So the next thing we're going to do is get the power bar. That's this sort of shield looking piece. We want to make sure it's folded in half, and then you can see this scoop that's in the top of the power bar, and you want to line that up with the scoop that's in the top of your bra, and that's going to be like the armhole. I like to match up my points first and then sort of pin out from those 2 sections. So you just kind of want to baste this in place, and I use 1/8 of an inch so that I know that that basting stitch is like inside of where the seam allowance will be later, so I don't see it. But I'm just going to do 1/8 of an inch around here, sink my needle, and then twist the fabric, and then continue sewing up here. So I've already done that for the other cup, so you can see that it's in there. So the power bar, this is your folded edge right here, and it's going to remain like this. It's sort of open. It's like a little pocket in there. That's how it's supposed to be. And that is it for the power bar. The last thing we're going to need to do on the cup is sew some skinny elastic along the top of this lace edge. Okay, so for skinny elastic, I said we're going to want to cover up this top edge. You want to sew over the top of where that power bar is, and then also along the edge of your lining fabric. So you don't want your lining fabric to extend past any of the scallops. If it does, you can just trim it back right now. It's an easy enough thing to do. So I generally don't pin this. I will just take my elastic and guide it in by hand. You don't want to have too many, or pretty much any tension on the elastic, because otherwise that might create sort of that quad boob look. So I just like to guide it in as I'm going. Now you're going to switch your machine to a zigzag stitch. Just the standard zigzag should be fine. And so here's what the finished edge looks like. Now the reason you're doing this is twofold. First is you're going to use this to sort of stabilize the lace. It helps those scallops from being stretching too far out of place, and it also cleans up the edge where the lining and the lace meet. So once you've sewn that in, that is it for the cups. So with the cups done, we can move on to the cradle. So what we're going to do is take our two pieces, and you want to make sure the lining's on the bottom and the lace is on the top. And we're going to join those together at the center front with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I don't bother covering up the seams because we're still going to use this stabilizer lining behind it, so that's going to cover up that center seam and you won't see it. Well, you'll see it, but it won't, like, the seams won't be open for fraying. So once again, I always find it easier to sort of pin 3 layers instead of 4. So I have the 2 laces right sides together and then one of the linings. And then one thing you really want to watch out for is just where your scallops are ending. So if you'll remember, we cut it so that 1/4 of an inch was the lowest portion of the scallop right here. So you just want to make sure you have that lined up, because that's what's going to give you a really beautiful arc in the center front. So once I have one side, I'll just flip it over, and then attach the lining to the other side. So now we're just going to sew this with a straight stitch at 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so now I've done that straight stitch, and if we open it out, let's see what we got. You can see we have this beautiful mirror image of that flower, so it almost looks like a complete flower, and the scallops sort of come to meet each other at the very center. So that's what we want to see. So the next thing I'm going to do is top stitch that seam allowance down. I just want to spread the seam allowance out, sort of give it a finger press, and then I'm going to do probably about 1/8 of an inch so that I catch everything, and just go down, across, and back up, just so that it's all nice and flat. Okay, so I've just finished doing that stitching just to keep that flat. Now you can barely see it on here, even though I've used sort of like a contrasting silver gray thread. I will say that lace is great for hiding a multitude of sins, because you really can't see how clean your stitching lines are on lace, because there's so much texture and movement in there that your stitches really do disappear. So I think lace is a great way to start making bras, just because your seams don't have to be as pretty on the exterior. So the next part we have to do, you'll remember that on my pattern I decided to cut this into 2 pieces. Originally this was all one long piece that extended into the back, but I decided to cut it into 2 pieces just because I like a different material to back my back band. So now we're just going to sew those extra pieces on. However, if you chose to leave the pattern as is, then you don't have to do this step. So I'll take my lace back band and plop it on there. And then I flip it around. And I have my power net, power mesh, which I will be putting on the lining side. It's just like we did for the front, line it up. We're going to sew this on with a straight stitch at 1/4 inch. So once you've done that, it should look something like this. And then we'll just take our 2 back wing pieces and fold them out and make sure all of your seams are encased inside of there. And just like we did for the cup, we're going to run sort of like a scant 1/4, 1/8 inch right along that side to make sure everything lays flat. So I've already done that for the other side. You can see what that looks like. So the last step for the band is to apply this inner strengthening lining. So what we're going to do is actually put it on the outside of the bra. I'm going to line up that top edge. We're going to sew this at 1/4 inch. So once you've sewn that on, you just flip it over and then back to the back side. So you can see what I mean, where this these exposed seam allowances in here kind of get covered up by this so that they're not going to be catching on anything. So I just let this float as I move on to the next couple of steps. It doesn't really bother me. This is all going to be covered up by elastic, so you won't see any of these raw edges. But if you are a little bit worried about letting this float in the meantime, you can always baste just along this cup seam to help keep it into more stable of a place. So the last thing that we are going to do today is insert those cups into the band itself. So here's our band, and we have our cups that we made earlier. So you're going to start at one end and just pin this into place all the way around, making sure you're catching this lining once you get to this side of the cup. I'm actually going to pin this off camera because it takes a little bit more finagling to get these curves to line up, but I'll show you what it looks like once it's pinned. So here we can see it is all pinned into place, and then if you look at the other side, we do have that lining that I've pinned into place right here. The lining ends right about where the power bar begins on the cup, if that makes any sense. So now that we have that all into place, we can just sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all along this curve. And that should do a good job of covering up all those basting stitches that we had from the power bar earlier. So now we have that cup sewn into place. You can see this is the line of stitching we've just done, and this was the basting stitches from the power bar. And when we turn it out to the outside, it looks like this. So you want to repeat that for the other cup, and that will be it for today. You've sewn all of the bra together, and now it's just a matter of putting in all of those different elastic pieces. So come back tomorrow when we finish this bra up.